Hello. Sorry for that, especially the friends that are connected online. Many thanks to all of you for joining us today for what we designed to be a very interactive and we hope interesting discussion about the war in Ukraine, 1 year after the beginning of this war. I am pleased as Executive Director of IDIS to have with us today such distinguished experts on the topic we are going to discuss. I would like to pay a special tribute to Alex Cooley and Julie Newton, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, for putting together for the second year a group of bright young scholars and academics to discuss Russia and Ukraine. Our panel is part of this program, and we are grateful to Columbia's Harriman Institute and Columbia Athens Global Center for their support. The theme that we chose to discuss with you today is the Western support for Ukraine and its impact on the course of the war, as well as the trends in American and European public opinion. Let's not forget that this is also a war of the words. It goes on for 1 year with unprecedented violence and intensity, both at the theater of operations and the virtual world. It is a war about territory, but at the same time about ideas and values. This is why the West cannot afford losing this war. Coming to public opinion, recent polls show that there is a clear division between Western and non-Western countries. So this is something to take into account as well. In this country and in this region, the problem is rather acute. Sometimes we don't even detect disinformation or influence. So this is why I'm very pleased to have with us very experienced policymakers and academics to discuss this topic. And I'm very pleased as well to have Yannis Paleologos to moderate the session, an excellent journalist, commentator, colleague from Kathimerini, to whom I pass the floor immediately. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ino, and thank you to everyone participating and watching. A couple of words first about the Columbia University Global Center in Athens. It just recently launched in November of 2022. It's part of a network of 10 global centers of the university across the world. And the mission of these centers is to promote and facilitate the collaborative and impactful engagement of the university's faculty, students, and alumni with the world to enhance understanding, address global challenges, and advance knowledge and its exchange. Now, today, as Ino mentioned, we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine and Western attitudes, predominantly Western attitudes towards that war. We are now more than 12 months into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the minor miracle of Western unity still flickers on. The EU has just passed its 10th round of sanctions against Russia, and the collective West remains committed to humanitarian, financial, and military aid to Ukraine. In fact, as the new Russian offensive is already underway and in anticipation of a coming counteroffensive by Ukraine, we see that Western countries are looking for ways to upgrade their military support in order to help the Ukrainian armed forces repel Russian advances and take back territory. And of course, the EU continues to have the Temporary Protection Directive in activation. It was activated a few days after the outbreak of the war last year, and it means that all Ukrainian refugees arriving into the EU have full rights to work, rights to accommodation, education, benefits, for a period of up to 3 years. And these policies, as we know from recent surveys, remain overwhelmingly supportive inside Europe. About 3/4 of Europeans continue to support sanctions against Russia. 74% are in favor of the policies backing Ukraine. Unfortunately, Greece is an outlier, is at the bottom of that particular category, along with Bulgaria, with only 48%. It bears mentioning that the effort to maintain Western unity and European unity has not been plain sailing, as the costs of sanctions for Europe mounted, and as the returns of further sanctions diminished, the negotiations in Brussels became more and more fraught. And the cost of unity has been that certain sectors have been exempted. Gas is one glaring example, nuclear, even diamond imports, because they're very important to Belgium. And also other sectors there's been a dilution of the sanctions in other sectors, including shipping, mostly at the behest of Greece, because Greek ship owners are major players in moving Russian products, and especially Russian fossil fuels. And of course, as the war drags on, and if it continues to settle into stalemate, the voices on both sides of the Atlantic saying that it's no use sending more support and that Kyiv must be pushed towards negotiations, these voices will grow louder. And it's notable, I think, that only yesterday, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and all but certain candidates for president, expressed his lack of support for continuing to back Ukraine. He says it's not a vital U.S. interest. And he said that he in fact, in a way that must have pleased Vladimir Putin, said that the issue is a territorial dispute between the two sides. So that was a bit unfortunate. But overall, I would say that despite the siren calls of national economic interests stemming from commercial ties with Russia, despite concerns about inflation and the economic slowdown caused by the war, the West, 13 months on, remains impressively united in the face of the war and its challenges. There is a consensus still that that Ukraine must win this war, and that the Western alliance must do its utmost to make that happen. There's also consensus that it's for the Ukrainians to define the nature of victory and the timing of peace negotiations, and also that Russia must be held accountable for its crimes and must help pay for the reconstruction of its neighbor. The war was recently described to me as a trial of weakness, a preuve de faiblesse in the original French. The argument was that it's a race between who will lose their stamina first, who will lose the ability to fight first. And the West must make sure that that is not Ukraine. And so far, 13 months in, for the most part, it's been doing its bit. Now, that's it from me. And I turn immediately to Professor Cooley for his opening remarks.
Yanis, thanks so much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. And yes, indeed, this is an event on the Columbia side that's co-partnered with the Harriman Institute and the newly formed Columbia Global Center. And although we don't have physical space yet, that's something we're working on, we do see the Global Center as an attempt to facilitate and host a wide variety of educational programs to serve as a regional hub for innovative and interdisciplinary research in collaboration with regional experts and institutions like IDIS, and to host programming like today's event that bring together Columbia University faculty, students, alumni with other leading experts, innovators, practitioners, members of civil society, and you to discuss a range of timely topics. So hopefully this is the first of many collaborations that we will have going forward. Now, let me talk about what I think is the paradox 1 year onwards of attitudes towards the war. And if I had to boil it down in one catchy phrase, as some Americans like to say, it's the West increasingly yes, united, and the rest increasingly ambivalent. And I think that both, in some ways, I think both have been surprising, but for different reasons, right? So what we saw in response to the events of February 24th, an unprecedented Western unity that I think even Western policymakers weren't expecting. This involved a rapid condemnation and a sequencing of sanctions. We saw the US, EU, UK, Japan announced a series of both financial and individual sanctions, including coordinated sanctions between the US Treasury and the European Central Bank. This was something that was truly innovative. We saw countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore agree to technology export controls. Switzerland joining the sanctions regime. We saw Germany announcing it will remilitarize, the cancellation of Nord Stream 2. And we saw then individually NATO member countries and other countries announce military supply for Ukraine, weapons of increasing sophistication. We saw NATO agree to admit Finland and Sweden, though we're still in the process of ratifications. There's some holdups with member countries, especially Turkey and Hungary. And I think perhaps the more unexpected one is that we saw this stigmatization of Russia that affected the private sector. And we saw the rapid, within a week, I would say, the rapid corporate pull out of Russia. We saw Western companies, not only like IKEA, McDonald's, symbolically set up in Red Square, Pizza Hut, but also oil majors like BP, ExxonMobil. When you think about BP, it had weathered every kind of political risk imaginable, mergers, forced acquisitions, Vladimir Putin coming to power, oligarch politics. It made a decision pretty quickly that it was going to strand its investments and get out. So this Western corporate presence and the kind of justification that they had that integrating Russia in the world economy would make them more favorably disposed to the Western position on many issues, that actually did not turn out to be the case. So we saw what I call with Dan Nexon in some of our writings, the kind of the US-led liberal hegemonic cartel in action, right, in its full reach. Europe, East Asia, levying a number of measures. So that's Western part. Also, many European, the stigmatization affected, I think, the domestic politics in a couple of ways. So leading figures that opposed the transatlantic coalition for political purposes play down their ties with Russia. We saw Marine Le Pen in the middle of a presidential campaign pull 1 million pamphlets that she had that had her alongside President Putin with the banner "Strong Leadership." And we saw in general a kind of a toxicity in domestic politics associated with these relations with Russia. However, in terms of the post-Soviet states, for lack of a better word, reaction, yes, the Baltic states were strongly at the front lines of condemning in the sanctions regime, but we saw a lot more ambiguity within the region itself. So countries like Georgia, been in a war with Russia, countries like Kazakhstan, Central Asia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, a lot more ambivalence. I would say a kind of an official neutrality. Why was this? Of course, there was a fear that now that Russia declared open season, that it could change borders, that had this revanchist type of development, that it could annex and recognize constitutionally occupied territories. There was, of course, and there is, of course, deep concern that that can happen in places like, northern Kazakhstan or Moldova or parts of Georgia still. But there was also almost uniform opposition and even a public lamenting of the sanctions, right? So again, a country like Georgia, disposed to the West, nevertheless refuses and still refuses to impose sanctions that would cripple its own wine industry or its own tourism industry or affect the remittances that it gets from Georgians working abroad. So I think this was a surprise to Western policymakers. Another surprise, I think, to all of us was how the institutions in the region of the post-Soviet space that Russia led were repurposed for different reasons. So we had this visa regime that it was meant to facilitate visa-free travel between Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, another part to Russia to enable migration. But what we saw were Russian exiles fleeing Russia after the war and then after the announcement mobilization to places like Yerevan, Tbilisi, Astana, Bishkek, trying to get away and setting up new types of communities there. I think this will have some very interesting political implications that we can talk about at other times. And in general, we saw public opinion quite sympathetic to Russia's position. I would say in Kazakhstan, it's split from what we know relatively evenly, backing Russia versus Ukraine. In Kyrgyzstan, public opinion tends to back Russia, and I think that's a function of the information space, of migration, and a number of different sort of framing type of issues. And now increasingly, we've seen skepticism in the global South about the war. So what's driving this in my last final 2 minutes? I think actually the factors that have enabled this Western unity are actually now at the source and the root of some of the global South skepticism about the war. So for example, take the stigmatization of Russia, right? I think one of the lines that we hear a lot is, yes, we're not naive. This is a military campaign, but we also saw a war fought by the U.S. in Iraq. We saw what happened in Afghanistan. We saw what happened in ISIS. And by the way, a lot of the post-Soviet states also have hosted conflicts, Nagorno-Karabakh, border conflicts between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So I think that's part of it. So the stigmatization leads to this idea that there's double standards, right? I think the refugee issue that you mentioned is one of those issues. Colleagues working on African politics have shared that the exemplary treatment that Ukrainian refugees have gotten contrasts with how African migrants and other types of migrants have also been treated at the same time. And then this meme of Western imperialism that's somehow conflated with NATO expansion, even though Ukrainian colleagues would talk about Russian imperialism in Ukraine, also has resonance. And especially on these two core issues of reconstruction aid and accountability. When we hear estimates of 350 billion at least, which will be required for Ukrainian reconstruction, I think that does generate certainly some sort of argument in the South that we don't have access to anywhere near these types of funds. And transitional justice and accountability also has, I think, a very ambiguous record in the global South. A lot of African countries have considered that this is a tool being waged against their own particular leaders. So it's not something that has resonance. So to wrap up, I think we're at a very interesting inflection point. I think this is the war that has galvanized the West in a way I think President Putin did not anticipate clearly. He thought the West would be divided and that he would continue these piecemeal tactics. But I do think in other parts there is an ambiguity that has nothing to do actually, and this is to me the lamentable. It has nothing to do with what Ukraine itself is or isn't doing. It actually plays into these other narratives and grievances about world order and changes world order and disaffection with world order that publics feel, and I think that elites also deploy. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I move directly to Emily Holland from the U.S. Naval War College for her initial remarks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm very glad to have arrived here. I was cutting it close, but I made it.
She had a very difficult journey, so we should all be very thankful that she's here.
So I want to just start by saying I really agree with everything that everybody said here, and I just want to add, I think, a little bit of dimension to that. My particular area of study is energy policy, particularly European energy policy. So for many years, when I was doing my PhD, in fact, under Alex, my PhD advisor, I wrote about why Europe had so much trouble achieving unity, particularly energy policy. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we saw really just absolutely unprecedented, not only European unity, but transatlantic unity on energy, it was really amazing. And Europe has accomplished things that I really never thought possible in the face of Russia's aggression. And this has really brought Europe together. So I want to preface that what has happened up till now has been transformative and seismic and amazing. However, there are some issues that are going on as Europe makes this adjustment to living in a world without Russian energy that are really going to cause some very significant shifts for Europe's economy and society. And those are the issues that I think we are beginning to see now that will probably continue to become exacerbated in the future, and that may lead to some issues in terms of how much unity there is in terms of supporting Ukraine in the future. So just to give some background, even prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe was in a very difficult situation. There was the pandemic, there was an energy crisis that predated Russia's invasion. Now there's this increasing decoupling of US and China, and this has caused a lot of very significant shifts for the European economy. And so far, to sort of protect European consumers, Europe, and that includes the UK, has earmarked about 800 billion to protect its consumers. It's, by the way, it's what it's allocated. It's not what it's spent. So you will have seen, of course, the very big German announcement that it had earmarked 200 billion to protect its consumers from high energy prices, and that were the result of Russia's war in Ukraine. That has not been spent, right? It's been allocated but not spent. So these countries are putting out significant resources to try to protect themselves from the effects of getting off of Russian energy. But what this does is it creates sort of difficult incentives. It is incentivizing the use of cheap electricity, which is, as we know, bad for the environment and counter towards the EU's net zero goals. And it's also exacerbating schisms within EU countries on energy policy. So you have probably heard about the difficulties that were involved in trying to get the EU to sanction Russian oil projects. Hungary was a significant outlier in this. They basically demanded a derogation. They demanded that they were able to remove themselves from these sanctions, and kind of negotiated a whole bunch of other little things that they could get out of this. And they weren't the only one. Hungary is sort of the loudest voice in this regard, but the Czech Republic also has derogated, and Bulgaria also has derogation. So there's all different countries with different interests here. And that was always the case in European politics. It's just that, there's so much momentum behind supporting Ukraine initially that those were pushed to the sides. But now we're really seeing those come back to the forefront. Just in the news today, in the past few weeks, there are significant disagreements happening right now in Brussels over the future of European nuclear policy, right? So now that we are removing Russian energy from Europe's energy mix, many are advocating that there needs to be more nuclear energy to make up that lack in the mix. But there are disagreements on states about whether they support that or not. And you're seeing some very, very interesting coalitions. For example, you're seeing the most extreme German Greens forming a coalition with Giorgia Meloni in Italy, right? So you're seeing these very strange coalitions moving together against certain aspects. Today, there's also been a discussion about the phase out of combustion engines by 2035. And you're seeing certain countries, in particular Germany, trying to move away from that in hopes to save their industry. And so you're getting all of these different forces that are now coming head to head that were kind of pushed together at the beginning. And what's really happening is you're having a question of European industrial policy. 40 million Europeans are engaged in industry. And the biggest question is, with now sustained high energy prices for the near future, how much of these jobs will stay in Europe? The last time that we had such high energy prices was 2008 to 2009. And during that crisis, a huge portion of industry left Europe and never came back. And that's what tends to happen when you have these sort of industrial shifts. You get industry leave and not come back. They go to places where it's cheaper, like South Asia or the Middle East. And so now we're faced with, what does this mean for Europe's economy? And we're starting to see this very, very big question pop up in European capitals, which is, how far are European governments willing to go, but willing to move away from basically economic efficiency and towards a model of strategic autonomy and geopolitical resilience, right? So right now we're in this mode of, okay, let's move towards strategic economy. Well, when that starts to rub up against economic efficiency, you start to have cracks. You start to see very powerful firms and certain governments say, wait a minute, let's hold back a bit. Let's think about this for a second. So I think that's where we're beginning to get to now. These issues are becoming more prescient and important in European politics. And on the other side, you think about, okay, we have had this unprecedented sanctions regime against Russia. We're sanctioning Russian energy for the first time. We didn't do that for Crimea. We sanctioned Russian oil. We sanctioned Russian coal. We're moving towards the oil ban, all of these different things. Well, that's great, but what are sanctions meant to do? Right? What's the purpose of sanctions? And there are many different purposes of sanctions that we might think about. One is to signal displeasure to the regime. Certainly these sanctions have done that, right? One is to perhaps punish Russian citizens who would then lobby their government to try to get them to stop the war. Well, clearly that has not happened, right? And then I think one of the main ones that we tend to think about is, have our sanctions deprived Russia of the means to wage war? And the answer to that is unfortunately not. And that's just a function of the way the Russian economy has insulated itself against global forces and interdependence. So although it is a part of the globalized economy, it has moved towards a kind of autonomous structure. And that is in part because they have felt that they are a victim of a sanctions regime that they are not going to get out of. Once we started imposing sanctions on Russia post-Crimea, their mindset was that we're never going to get out of these sanctions, so we have to indigenize things. And so they began indigenizing processes in defense and other areas, which makes it a little bit hard to punish them. On top of it, as we began to sanction all of their energy, that caused prices to rise more. And so as a result, Russia made more in 2021 from oil and gas sales than they had in the last 6 years. Okay, they made billions and billions of euros. So they still have that money. They have enough money to wage the war. And now, as we have moved towards the shift of decoupling Europe from Russian energy, they have indeed found other buyers. Those flows, those oil and gas flows, have shifted to China and India. So as we have decoupled from from Russia, there are new institutions and bounds being created, and you have to think about, well, what are the implications of that moving forward? As Alex said, much of the world is ambivalent. You see countries like India buying more and more Russian oil and refusing to really get involved. And then you think about even third-party countries, which are sort of indirectly affected. For example, this is one of my favorite examples, the Sri Lankan fishing industry was collapsed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Why? Because it sent kerosene prices through the roof, so fishermen could no longer afford kerosene for refrigeration, and it collapsed the entire fishing industry in Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lankans don't really care that much about Russia's war in Ukraine, but they do care about their livelihood, right? They do care about losing a severe industry for them. And so you start to see these other countries say, hey, wait a minute, we just care about our interests here and not so much about what's happening on the European continent. And it's interesting because to me, the Russian war in Ukraine is really a 20th century conflict, but now we're in the 21st century. So there's all kinds of interconnectedness and webs that are going to cause a lot of implications down the road, and that might make it difficult to sort of keep up unity in the long term, given that the US in particular has a lot of interest even outside the European continent. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Emily. Paula Redondo, Public Diplomacy Officer for Russia at NATO. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here in sunny Athens. It's a nice change from Brussels. As you can imagine, it's cold and rainy there. Surprise, surprise. So I'm going to talk to you today about NATO's response about Russia's invasions of Ukraine. It's been already more than a year since Russia launched its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, and clearly President Putin is not preparing for peace, he's preparing for more war, and I think this is important to take in consideration. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shattered peace in Europe, and in addition to the unimaginable suffering that is causing to Ukrainians and the destruction that is causing in Ukraine, is also seriously undermining the international rules-based order. And because of Russian aggression, our overall security environment has become more dangerous and more unpredictable, and this affects all of us. It doesn't matter how close and how far we are from Ukraine. NATO has responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with remarkable unity and resolve to do two things. First of all, to protect NATO allies and prevent escalation, because NATO is a defensive alliance, and more war will only bring more suffering to more people. And second, not least important, to help Ukraine defend itself from this illegal act of Russian aggression, because Ukraine has the right to self-defense because it is enshrined in the UN Charter, and we also cannot forget this part here. For all of this, NATO quickly activated its defense plans and is undertaking the largest reinforcement of our collective defense. We have also put forward a strong front of support for Ukraine. With this, we are also ensuring that there is no room for misunderstanding from the part of Moscow that NATO is ready to defend every inch of its territory. At the same time, we have made very clear that NATO is not seeking confrontation and we are not posing a threat to Russia, but we will to continue to respond to Russian threats in a united and responsible way. It has been mentioned before that Putin made some strategic mistake, mostly two. He underestimated Ukraine and its willingness to defend this country. And second, he also underestimated NATO's unity, and we can talk more generally, he underestimated Western unity. President Putin thought that he would take Kiev in a matter of days, Ukraine in a matter of weeks, but the reality is that Russian soldiers has pushed back in different fronts, Kiev, Kharkiv, Kherson in the south, and now Russia is still launching new offensive around Bakhmut, throwing waves of soldiers in a way that we have not seen since the 20th century. They were talking before about whether this was a 20th century war or a 21st century. Moreover, if what Putin wanted when he started this war was a weaker and divided NATO, what he got as an answer is a stronger NATO, more united than ever, and with two new countries, Finland and Sweden, that are on track to become members of NATO. And on top of that, NATO's partnership with the European Union is now closer and more important than ever. Now to the topic of public support. Public support for Ukraine in NATO countries and European countries in general has been unprecedented. I think we all agree to that. In addition to the military and humanitarian support that governments have provided, our citizens have welcomed refugees in their houses, have initiated campaigns online, have initiated crowdfunding campaigns for Ukrainian civilians, and even showing the moral support of putting a Ukrainian flag, even though that's not sending anything, that shows the moral support that is with Ukraine and the demonstration that we are actually all standing with Ukraine. But of course, we are also not blind to the fact that this conflict created by Russia has unleashed, in addition to this death and destruction, also an economic crisis that is affecting our economies and our citizens. Russia knows this very well, and it's trying to exploit it also to their advantage. They are trying to erode Western support, talking about how winter was going to be very difficult, how the sanctions are affecting our economy, and combining all of this narrative with also cruel and unrelentless attacks against Ukraine, like the one that we saw last week, bombing civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and pushing these aggressive narratives that portrayed Western military support as the only culprit for the duration of the war. The reason is like, there is no more weapons, the war will end. That's Russia's reasoning to show that. So we continue to witness how Russia is creating this alternative reality of events in Ukraine to reinforce their justification for the war. They have been also adapting their narratives about NATO and the West to reframe their losses. Last autumn, Russia wanted to believe that Western efforts to support Ukraine were useless because they were going to win anyway. Now they were talking about winter, as I mentioned before, how winter was going to be very difficult to survive, but anyway, winter passed. Ukraine is still there, we are still here. And currently the most prominent story about about the alliance in Russia is that Russia is at war with NATO in Ukraine, and they are using this just to justify the fact that they were not able to take Ukraine so quickly, and to explain why they were not performing better. Overall, Russian hostile information activities targeted at NATO audiences have not been very successful. Of course, some of them are, but in general, we can say that their tactics have not been very sophisticated. And a key contributor to this was the declassification of intelligence at the beginning of the war, and the fact that NATO countries were able to get ahead of the narrative, explaining and exposing Putin's plans before he could actually implement them. This declassification of information, it was also a way for us to show our support for a diplomatic solution to the conflict before the war starting, and actually to try to prevent the conflict for happening. The amount of intelligence declassified and the speed, as this has done, for those of you working in government, probably you know that declassifying intelligence is something that is something very difficult to do, takes a lot of layers. So it was a very bold decisions that government took at the time, and it was full of risk, because you may remember how we were accused. The U.S. was accused of warmongering, of wanting a war, because we were talking about the war when before it started. But another key point of why Russian disinformation has also not been very successful is because Ukrainians have been extremely good at communicating. They have been mastering the art of crisis communication. President Zelensky has proved to be an excellent communicator. He communicates in a very straightforward and personal way, with bravery, with empathy, and this has been also key in galvanizing international support for Ukraine and actually countering Russian disinformation. So these are some of the reasons why these Russian disinformation and hostile information activities have not been very effective, and why the support of Ukraine in NATO public, if I can call it that way, is still very strong and very high, despite 1 year of war with also parts of economic problems brought by the war. So there is this mobilization of allied public support of Ukraine. But of course, this is not only about disinformation. It's also about our values. It's about respect for human rights and fundamental freedom. And ultimately, Russian behavior in the information environment is aiming to undermine everything that we stand for. I mentioned the international rules-based order, but also our security, our common values, and our democracy and our rule of law. And I will finish only with one thought. We hear a lot that most wars end with negotiations. This is generally true. But in order to enable Ukraine to achieve a just and sustainable peace, and if and when the moment for negotiation comes, we must continue to provide military support so Ukraine is in the best position possible to be able to negotiate. And we can also not forget that if Putin wins, that will also send a signal to other authoritarian regimes that they can use force to achieve their goals, and that will make the whole world more dangerous. And just a reminder that our financial support for Ukraine is not charity, it's an investment in our security. Thank you.
Okay, Paula, thank you very much. I'm going to now briefly abuse my position as a moderator to ask each of you a question in reverse order, and then we can move to questions from all of you. So, Paula, starting with you, you said right at the end there that backing Ukraine is an investment in our security. There are some among the strongest backers of Ukraine who would claim that there's been both an underinvestment and a delay in implementing the investment, i.e., there's always this discussion that Ukrainians make certain requests for sophisticated arms. Most countries say, no, that's impossible. Then a few months later, they say yes. And by that time has been lost, and so on and so forth. And we have another iteration of this debate now. And the question is it your sense that the NATO allies have realized the importance of arming Ukraine as much as possible, as fast as possible, because that, in fact, is the shortest route to peace? And secondly, has there been enough reorganization and a realization that there are significant technical obstacles because of chronic post-Cold War underinvestment in weapons production? And are things being done now to begin to rectify that?
Thanks a lot for the question. Of course, NATO as an organization, we are not providing lethal support to Ukraine. This is the allies in a bilateral way that are the ones providing the weapons. NATO is providing mostly things such as generators, helmets, and other kind of non-lethal support to Ukraine, because as I mentioned, NATO is a defensive alliance, so we are not providing lethal support to Ukraine. NATO allies in a bilateral way, of course, is their sovereign right to decide what kind of weapons they have to provide, and they have been very strong on their support in the Madrid summit. They agreed to provide Ukraine with a strengthened package of support, and they are also helping Ukraine transition from Soviet-era military equipment to modern NATO equipment, boost interoperability, and further strengthen defense and security institutions. And as you know, all of this takes time. So some of those debates that we see, some of them are created by different political discussion that happen in any democracy. Others are created by these issues that you mentioned, this interoperability, how fast can Ukraine absorb some of that capacity that we are sending. I think it has been said many times in the press that Ukrainian troops in general are very quick learners and unable to absorb things at a much faster pace. So I don't know if that's something that also has changed the consideration from Zona Life when they are providing weapons. And at the same time, of course, the issue of stockpiles, that I think that's what you were hinting at, the fact that we were at peace. We are not at peace anymore, and at peacetime, governments maybe were not focusing so much in investing in defense in general, because it's at peace, and because we were at peace and we had other priorities. Now we realize that the security environment has changed a lot; it's much more dangerous, much more unpredictable, and we also need to fill these stockpiles. And we are working also in NATO to try to serve as a platform for allies to discuss with issues, and also in close cooperation with the European Union, because we need to be able to ramp up arms production, both to replenish these allies' stockpiles that, as I mentioned, are not as full maybe as they should, and also to ensure that we can continue supplying arms to Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Emily, on energy, I wanted to ask to what extent, so there's been one of the positive surprises has been that Europe has been able to weather the energy shock of the cutoff of especially of Russian gas very successfully this winter. To what extent do you think this is just dumb luck because it was a mild winter? To what extent is it down to a strong policy response? And therefore, how tough is it going to be to achieve next year if the weather turns a lot worse? And secondly, on oil especially, could it be argued, I mean, it's certainly been, to my understanding at least, the volumes of Russian exports have returned to pre-price cap levels because of the increased demand in India and China. But the price cap combined with other factors has meant that they earn a lot less because of it. And you can see that in the budget, both in December and in January. So could it be argued that the oil ban plus the price cap is having finally a significant effect in the Russian revenues from fossil fuels? Thanks.
Those are great questions. So the first one regarding winter, Europe was very, very lucky. It could have easily gone another way. That's not to say that policy wasn't instrumental. The 15% reduction in demand was absolutely crucial. I think it was too little too late, and it needs to be continued for the next few years. I wrote a piece about this in March last year, basically advocating for a urgent demand in energy reduction, not just because of the effects on Europe and its energy security, but also on the rest of the world. Because the reality is that for the next, I would say 5 to 10 years, the world is in a pretty tight energy market. There's just not a tremendous amount of spare capacity, and there are other countries that are demanding to use a lot of energy. So for Europe, yes, it's been incredibly lucky. The weather was very, very mild, but we're already now down to about 50% in the storage units. And that needs to be managed like gold for the next few years, because you cannot switch decades of energy policy on a dime. These things take a long time to sort of about face, and there has been tremendous help in terms of American LNG, Norwegian LNG, all kinds of different liquefied natural gases coming to the market to help Europe get through the next few years. But these are not guaranteed forever. They could go other places, and LNG goes to where the price is higher. Right now, Europe's willing to pay those costs, but there might be other consumers down the line that will pay more for that. And so that would be a very difficult problem for Europe. So for the next 2 winters, Europe is still not out of the woods yet. There's going to continue to need to be demand reductions as well as cooperative weather for it to be okay. Regarding oil, yes, oil volumes, Russia's exports are back to pre-war levels. They are actually a little bit higher. I just checked. Their refining and production this month, March, is back up to basically 100% output. But yes, the price is down. So prior to the oil ban, Russia was selling on average about over $100 a barrel because buyers were basically wanting to buy every last drop that they could. Now, they're probably clearing less than about $45 a barrel to premium Asian markets. So that will definitely hurt the Russians. And when I say that maybe sanctions aren't depriving them of the means to wage war, it doesn't mean that sanctions are not really, really structurally hurting Russia's economy, because they are. Russia's economy has been in trouble for many years. It's like the classic case of a petrostate, one that was not able to diversify to any basically other types of economic output. And this is going to cause severe harm. It's basically, retarding their economic growth, I would say 30 years. But that said, they are going to be able to still make a considerable amount of money off of their oil resources because we're in such a tight oil market. And that is partly because the West in particular significantly underinvested in oil and gas exploration over the last decade or so. So it's it's a complicated issue.
Okay, thanks for that. Alex, turning to you, I think the best way I can phrase this is, what the hell is going on with the Republican Party? And given that the 2 preeminent candidates for president on the Republican side now seem to be saying enough is enough with helping Ukraine, but one of them is saying he can solve the issue in 24 hours, I think, just by giving off some chunks of Ukraine that he doesn't own. But what's going on there? Is there a trend towards the party becoming firmly anti-NATO? And is it? Do you share the assessment of some who have already voiced this concern that all Putin needs to do is hold on until January 2025 in case there's a Republican victory in the next presidential election?
It's a great question. It's a tough question. I'm going to leave the data on Republican attitudes towards Ukraine and Russia to my colleague Mike Miller in the second part, because he has access to some of that polling data. But let me answer it in this way. I think there's a political dimension. I think there's a genuine ideological dimension here. The political dimension is that the Republican Party, certain elements of the Republican Party, do have an affinity for what they believe, right, casually, that Russia represents, whether it's this kind of conservative values, this kind of populism, this sort of tough man image, also the religious angle that Putin likes to play up. And you see this in the #1 rated news show in the US is Tucker Carlson. From the very beginning has taken what I lament is, a pro-Russia line. So that's part of it. But there's another thing going on, right? Trump is the presumptive nominee until he gets knocked off, right? So DeSantis tacking to that is in a way depriving Trump of that issue, right? And so think of it sort of strategically. With the Republican base itself so split, and with MAGA voters actually ambivalent on Ukraine or even backing Russia, I think DeSantis is calculating he doesn't lose anything in the primary. So that's regarding primary politics. In the actual general election, will he take that hard of a line? My guess is probably no, right? He'll try and dial it back. But to win the primary, he absolutely has to align with Trump and not leave Trump any policy differences. I think that's the way he's thinking about it. I'm not sure it's correct, but that's the way he's thinking about it. One final thing, though, and this is really insider stuff, so I'll just briefly break it in. We had impeachment of a U.S. president for two different issues. One was January 6th, but before that was a phone call with Zelensky in which essentially President Trump extorted Zelensky over delivery of lethal aid and demanded that political dirt be brought up on his opponent. And so part of the counter narrative in certain, not all, certain Republican circles is that it's Zelensky who entrapped Trump, that the Ukrainians are somehow the ones who are like manipulative, right? That they're the ones who are actually trying to sort of entrap and bind the U.S. And you're seeing this in some of the congressional minority making these kind of connections like money for the border, not for Ukraine, right? And as these requests, these expenditures now go to a Republican-led Congress, this is going to greatly complicate appropriations for this. So I think there's a lot of domestic issues going on, but I would differentiate sort of DeSantis in the primary versus if he gets the nomination, DeSantis in the general, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, the anti-Ukraine obsession of MAGA Republicans goes back to 2016, really, when they tried to argue that it was Ukraine and not Russia that interfered in the election. But enough from me. Questions from the audience, please tell us your name and what you do and ask a question and not a comment. The gentleman there. And tell us who you're addressing the question to if it's not to everyone.
So thank you. I have two questions, actually. My name is Euripides Tsakidis, and I work for the Hellenic Parliament Defense Policy. So the first question is, the war in Ukraine is clearly a Russian intelligence failure in many aspects. Is it also a Western intelligence failure in some aspects? How would the panel, and especially Mrs. Holland, who spoke about energy, how would they rate EU preparedness coming into this conflict? And the second question is, there's a 49%, not the most recent Gallup polling, but the Gallup polling that is recent enough has shown that 49% of the United States voters support, I think, that China is the number one enemy of the United, or it's number one adversary of the United States. And that number might be higher for people who are actually more likely to vote, in categories of people who are more likely voters. So how would you, Mr. Cooley, rate this in relation to what you just said on domestic politics? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any insider information on that, but certainly I think we were all very surprised. Even very, very close observers of European energy were surprised by just how willing states were to move ahead and sanction Russian energy. That said, I think that the West probably did not do enough to anticipate the ripple effects of what a very quick and extreme sanctions regime, coupled with what Alex said at the beginning, really severe self-sanctioning by corporations, would do to affect European energy security. Energy security was sort of always on the table in Europe, but it was sort of kind of pushed to the back because nobody could agree on it. And then it was sort of thrust to the forefront, and you're forced to engage with this huge change very immediately. And I don't think that the West really thought through what that might mean sort of down the line for European security at large. Yeah,
I think there was this perception of a lack of preparedness was probably bolstered by the chaotic pullout from Afghanistan. Certainly, I think this was on Putin's mind when he saw just how uncoordinated this was in the images of troops getting out of Kabul, Saigon style. But I do think the calibration that the U.S. insisted upon a response was born out of some of these painful experiences in lack of transatlantic unity, like on the subdeal, for instance. And so I think it was quite clear that while the French and German intelligence services doubted that this was going to happen, the U.S. basically lined up a response if it did. And that's why you had that coordination, that quick coordination sort of afterwards. You're absolutely right. Most 49% do consider China the greatest threat. There's an interesting partisan schism on this. Republicans tend to see China as the greatest threat. Democrats tend to see Russia as the greatest threat. Democrats also feel like domestic militias are also threats. But having said that, I just saw the latest Gallup poll had Russia's favorability ratings at an all-time low. It's at 9% now in the U.S. public, so it's not either or. But I think one more analytical point, there is a category, people certainly before we said, oh, we should forget Russia and focus on China, right? Russia's a short-term regional or tactical sort of threat. China is the long-term strategic partner. I think what the war has done, though, it's actually recast what can happen with China. Certainly the Chinese have learned about coordinated sanctions, about Western unity, about questions of sort of weaponry and supply. And so I think there's more Western unity now on China than there was before the war. So I do think the two interact in interesting ways.
Well, I don't think we can call this a Western intelligence failure. Russian intelligence failure, definitely. It's clear they thought that they were going to take Kiev in 3 days, and they were going there with food supply for 3 days and fuel supply for 3 days. So I think that's clear. Western intelligence failure, I don't think so. I think the intelligence that the US released and that the UK's release was right. Unfortunately, the invasion happened pretty much as the plan that they had disclosed exactly said. And even if there was some leaders that they didn't think that this was going to happen, or they were a bit more skeptic, everyone, at least in NATO, everyone prepared and acted as if it was going to happen. That's why we were able to show this unprecedented transatlantic unity so quick. Right after the invasion, we activated our NATO defense plans right after the invasion. And these were plans that had been prepared for many, many years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this was all done very quickly right after the invasion, because we were prepared, because we had been told by the intelligence that was released. I'm not saying anything secret here. The intelligence that was released to the public also, that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. So I don't think we can call it a failure.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the time, so we'll take one more quick question. The lady in the second row.
Hello, my name is Iris Patra, and I'm a recent graduate of Columbia University at the School of Professional Studies in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. Last year, Professor Cooley was part of an experts panel at Columbia Law Library 2 weeks right after the Russian invasion about the war. And I was wondering now, 1 year later, that you are here in a similar panel, in what ways you have become wiser in terms of how these two countries have been handling this war these months. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that. I don't feel like I'm any wiser. I feel like I have more questions, to be very honest. And I feel, yeah, I know, but I feel what started as, for us anyway, this very definitive conflict of an aggressor waging what is in essence a war of genocide. It's not just of territory. When you sort of view about, the denial of Ukrainian identity, the prepared kind of justifications that they had to publish and so forth, a very kind of clear countering of Russia's war of aggression has now morphed, as I think inevitably does, into much larger questions, right? About global order, about the global South, about the post-Soviet space, about Western unity, about how we treat refugees. And so all of these other issues have become entangled with this war, right? The Ukrainians continue extraordinary bravery in terms of how they fight in all this. But they're finding, I think, that a lot of global agendas, and Emily talked about the energy, which is just one big piece, but it's huge, are intertwined with the conflict. And so I think my take home, and I don't think it's wisdom, but Russia for about 15, 20 years now, since it's been doing working groups and track twos and things, they have almost been obsessed with this idea that the rules-based Western order is about to change, right? It's going to end. We're going to have something. We're going to have a post-Western world, right? And Russia's going to be a player in that. And so I think what we might be getting is paradoxically the acceleration to a post-Western world, but the degradation of Russian capabilities and stature within it. So we might well come out of this in a post-Western world, but Russia, ironically, will be less of a player in this world than it was as the main revisionist power in the post-Cold War world.
Okay, great. That sums up the first panel, and we move to the second panel immediately.
Yep.
Influences and drivers of domestic public opinion in US and Europe. And without further ado, I begin with our first contributor who will speak to us remotely through the wonder of technology, Elisaveta Goffman from the University of Groningen. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this conference. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, although I'm sure that Athens is lovely right now. So what I wanted to talk to you about is the Russian-Ukrainian war in Germany and the Netherlands. These are two countries that I've been professionally associated with. I worked and lived in both of them, and I wanted to give you a quick overview of what is happening there in terms of the year into Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. So I'll start with Germany, and in a sense, here the support for Russia's action in Ukraine can be kind of summarized in a little testing of a horseshoe theory in action. In a sense, we have both the far left and the far right that are both aligning themselves with the position of Russia's President Vladimir Putin. So, for instance, you have the leader of the left party, Die Linke, Sarah Wagenknecht, who actually accused the German government of launching an unprecedented economic war against our most important energy supplier. This is something that she said in September 2022, even though she initially actually condemned the attack on the 24th of February, so the launch of the full-scale war, as something that was against the international law. She's still one of the people that is actively pursuing negotiations with Russia. Something that she also published recently was a peace manifesto that demands negotiations with Russia and a stop of weapons deliveries to Ukraine from Germany. This is something that is not that far away from some of the German intellectual position. For instance, you might have heard of the recent op-ed that Jürgen Habermas penned for Süddeutsche Zeitung, where he also talked about the importance of negotiations, but this was from a much more measured perspective, where he was reflecting more on the ethical implications that the German government is taking on as a weapons delivery country in the war against Ukraine. However, on the very far right, on the German political spectrum, we also have different types of movements. For instance, the so-called Querdenker, so the people who actually are formerly used to be the COVID denialists and anti-vaxxers, very close to QAnon conspiracy theories, or those who claim to understand Putin. So in German, they're called Putin-Versteher. Also on the same side of the far right spectrum, you have the so-called Reichsbürger. So it's a kind of a neo-Nazi, very loose organization that is very well, has some neo-Nazi supporters, and there were several arrests that were done recently in Germany in relation to their ideology, but in a sense, they're kind of also the American analog would be sort of far-right preppers. And what you can also hear among the Querdenker, so among the people who used to deny that COVID exists, they also pretty much parroting a lot of the Russian propaganda points, saying that Russia's attack on Ukraine was to prevent genocide that was being perpetrated by Ukraine and NATO. A lot of the demonstrations that actually feature Querdenker also have some anti-NATO points. They also very actively say that Ukraine is a neo-Nazi country. And the interesting part, though, is that the Querdenker, so the people who actually started the protests against the mitigating measures against COVID, they actually openly even admit that the reason they talk about Ukraine war right now is because they want to strategically reorient towards the topic of inflation and energy security. So because the COVID is something that's done already, and they cannot really shore up a lot of public support or some kind of base for their movement. So now they pretty much turned almost completely from COVID to Russia's war against Ukraine. And here is one of the photos from one of those protests in Cologne that took place. For pretty much what they say is that we need to stop the war because our life should be affordable. There should be no weapons deliveries to Ukraine, and that NATO should be dissolved. So, but again, like the main focus of their point is that we should, like, our economic situation should not suffer because of Ukraine's resistance to negotiations. However, we all can also see some interesting flags at the Dutch farmer protest that took place on the 11th of March 2023, so pretty much a couple of days ago. And there you could also see some supporters of Russia, apparently. So you see the flag of Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. What the farmers' protest actually is about is actually a completely internal issue for the Dutch politics. It's about nitrogen and reducing the levels of nitrogen that the farmers are protesting against. But a lot of the participants in that protest actually also align with the position against the the Dutch government's position in supporting Ukraine, or aligning with President Putin's position in this regard. One of the main agents in this on this spectrum is the far-right party that is called Forum for Democracy, and its main leader, Thierry Baudet, who also apparently believes that the world is being governed by evil reptiles, that he mentioned several times, even though he then said that he was joking. He also several times professed his support for Russian President Vladimir Putin and said that he actually hoped that Putin would win the war in Ukraine. And a lot of the rhetoric that he uses is actually quite anti-Semitic and white supremacist. So he pretty much talks about how Russia is defending the white world order in Ukraine. And he also posts a lot of videos where he talks about what actually is happening in Ukraine. And ideologically, he sometimes is aligning himself with the Russian neo-fascist philosopher Dugin, which is also interesting conflagration. Another person who the parts of the American audience might have seen on Tucker Carlson's show is Eva Vlaardingenbroek. She's a former Forum for Democracy member, and she is also one of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists who talks about how the Dutch farmers are just, stand-up, regular, hardworking people who are just standing to stop the globalist agenda. So again, like an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but apparently she was even she had to leave the Forum for Democracy party at some point because of this, because of some of her opposition to Thierry Baudet. So just a couple of concluding thoughts, to say that there are both of these kind of movements. So Forum for Democracy, yes, it's a party that actually is in the Dutch parliament. Die Linke also in the German parliament. But those kind of positions are relatively fringe in both cases. In some ways, we can also see some of the anti-governmental ideology. So, for example, Forum for Democracy positions themselves as the main critique of the Rutte government in the Netherlands, and we can also see that Die Linke also position themselves as the main critique of the government in Germany. At the same time, there is definitely some ethical concerns, especially in Germany, about the ethics of weapons deliveries that are coming from Germany to Ukraine. So, in part, that's also motivated by a lot of the memories of the Second World War. So this is a lot of kind of cultural baggage that also affecting this types of discussion. At the same time, the Dutch public opinion is a little bit more homogenous when it comes to the way the war against Ukraine is framed, and Forum for Democracy is indeed one of the more fringe and their position finds much less support among the Dutch population, even though we have seen some of the reduction in public support for refugees and continued support of the refugees both in the Netherlands and in Germany. But we can still talk about how there is a broader public consensus for continued support in Ukraine in both cases. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. And I move immediately to Nada Kovalchikova, Senior Analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I will also have a short PowerPoint presentation with some visuals. But first, I will run you through the points I would like to raise. So first, what is being done at the EU level to first monitor, analyze, detect these kind of narratives that are detrimental to democracy, to our security, undermining the credibility of the European Union member states or allies in the information space, but also beyond, in not only the digital space, but also in the traditional space. Then we will look at how these narratives have been evolving because of the Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So since 1 year, but even longer, because this is not the first invasion. Then what is the public opinion that is being shaped within the European Union and elsewhere, and how is it being done, and what can we do about it, or what we have been already doing about it, but what can be done perhaps next. So In my presentation, I would like to start with looking at also different actors, in this case, state actors, as we have spoken a lot about Russia's interference and the spread of disinformation, but also China's role and how they are either complementary or what differs and what has been evolving since the previous also incidents in the information space that have been kind of remarkable to note. So first, I would like to show some differences. So we will see certain evolution. You see the visual of Russia and China. So on Russia's side, it has been quite a tradition that Russia has been trying to portray itself in a positive image, especially on certain sensitive issues, be it historical issues, geopolitical, economic issues, or whatever is sensitive at the moment. Russia always tries to turn it around in a way to look in a better light or be more aggressive in the information space to kind of defend by attack. With China, China has been having for a long time a strategy of more positive image writ large. So just kind of also redirecting the attention from some internal issues and really just focusing on how China has been contributing on the multilateral international stage through other types of achievements to really deflect the attention from more internal affairs. While Russia would be speaking positively about the internal domestic things as much as they could. Russia has a tradition of really divisive narratives to polarize, to drive wedges between the EU member states, EU and NATO, between different communities within the countries, to just really create this type of divisions, confusion, and undermine the solidarity also towards each other in critical situations. China has not been really known for doing the same things, but what we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, that China has become also more assertive in the information space, especially because there has been very strong critique of China as being of the origin of the spreading or not preventing the spread of the virus. Hence, we have seen certain evolution of China's behavior in the information space to deflect the blame, to perhaps even intentionally spread narratives of Russia, so kind of contributing to the amplification. And that has been quite a new phenomenon in the information space. Now, where Russia and China have become more similar as well, you can see it especially in the last two paragraphs, where they have been trying to portray themselves either as victims, so not really being the aggressors, or as the benefactors or helpers to the countries. During the COVID-19 pandemic, China has had a very strong information campaign to portray itself not only in Europe or US, but globally as a helper with vaccines. And similarly, we saw it also on Russia's side, especially in Eastern neighborhood, Western Balkans, with their Sputnik 5 vaccine and other ways of providing some medical equipment. Also, second interesting thing with regards to Ukraine, it's the last paragraph. You can see that, again, that was more of a narrative of that Russia is a victim. It has been pushed to the wall for a long time. Russia was using the narrative of being as trying to be eliminated by the so-called West, as you could see on the left, and by China, you see it kind of showing the respect towards the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity in a way, to play in the cards of Russia in this sense that, foreign other actors should not be really playing a role, not providing necessarily the equipment, the support, military support especially. But again, we see also the net of pushing Russia against the wall, undermining peaceful resolution of the crisis, which is very interesting. Here you see one of the products of the EU versus Disinfo website, which is led by the External Action Service of the European Union. It's from last year. And what is interesting, it's not only the content that you see there, that what are narratives from President Vladimir Putin, and what are kind of the interpretations to translate what it really means by the people working on the platform. But I think what is also important is how there has been evolution of exposing the information manipulation and information online to wider audiences, being a public source for anyone to access. These are the products that are public. They're also collecting products from other think tanks, academic experts, or different types of publications that are working and researching on these issues. So really providing a little bit also a database of the narratives, of the publications, of the research on this, but also the way it's being done. You can see here, it's not only very clear, but also using the sense of humor. We saw by previous speaker, Lisa, showing us how the visuals, the images of the president with the researcher and others were on the horse, kind of a humoristic way to attract attention. And this is one of the things that has been evolving also on the institutional front of the EU and the member state and NATO to also play with these emotions as much as Russia has been playing with emotions to trigger certain emotions to have wider or bigger impact. And we see that this can be also used and has been used more on the institutional side. And the last slide that I would like to show to you is the public polling. So what has been the opinion? Has there been influence in what do people think across different European countries? There is a selection of the countries, the research done by the European Council on Foreign Relations from last May, so after a couple of months after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And on the left side, you see where people who were polled, who were asked if they considered Russia to be the biggest obstacle to peace between Russia and Ukraine, or was it rather Ukraine, the US, and EU? And it's very interesting to see the countries that you see on the top, being Finland or Sweden or Great Britain, kind of those countries that really saw that Russia is the primary actor to consider as preventing the peace, or even stronger to actually contributing or leading the war, as we see very high percentages. Very low, where people would still believe that it's the other side that has caused it or provoked it or whatever. But then you also see certain countries that actually are not as straightforward, especially on the lower side. What does it say? It means that we cannot take it for granted that people in Europe, EU, and US automatically will just know everything, understand everything, and not be influenced also by other sources and other narratives that are flowing there. So we are clearly far away from succeeding fully for making people fully educated on this, or aware, or having the tools to build the resilience against information manipulation. But we also have to constantly monitor and track this to also see perhaps what are the periods of time, what are the events, what are the narratives that work more or less to also be able to better counter them. So I'll just end the presentation here. So what can we, how can we do this, right? So now we understand it's been decades that we know that Russia, but also other actors have been leading information or disinformation campaigns. We have been investing more resources into this at the national level, local, even national and international level, EU level. But how do we know that this really works, and how can we still have this kind of results where we have such a large percentage of population believing these things? So what has been done most recently? So we have been discussing about the toolkits. So we have toolkits at the national level, at the EU level, at the NATO level, to be able to not only counter, but also potentially, hopefully, prevent this kind of effort somehow, or pre-bank, or have the tools to detect early enough so we can limit or mitigate the negative impact of such narratives. So on the EU side, we see that there is a third toolbox that is being built up. So cyber security toolbox, hybrid threats toolbox, and now foreign information manipulation and interference toolbox. And what does it mean? It also shows that these three toolboxes, on one hand, have to have separate tools to be able to be more effective and have wider outreach, but also that they are kind of building on each other's issues. So looking at also the issues of information manipulation, disinformation in a more holistic manner. So many times when there is a cyber attack and the critical infrastructure, it happens also at the same time when you have information campaigns about other issues in the information space. At the same time, there may be some trade deals being done or some economic coercion happening. So understanding that none of these issues are happening in isolation is first. Hence why we are also many times talking about hybrid threats. These tools are not used independently of each other and actually enhance each other's effect. So I think that's one, the awareness and realization of that, recognition of the importance of understanding the wider context and taking and addressing it in a wider context can be actually very helpful. Second, you can see at the EU level, there is a growing regulatory approach. So one of the issues with disinformation, countering disinformation, is that there's no legal basis necessarily for stopping the creation and dissemination in a systematic way. However, at the same time, moving from addressing disinformation to addressing the manipulation of information online, so also the algorithms and the amplification of it, shows that there can be certain tools, legal tools, regulatory tools, that can be used, such as, at the EU level, the new Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, that is looking more also at political advertising of different algorithms, use micro-targeting, and the role of wider actors being advertisers, social media companies, and others that play an important role to either allow this to happen or potentially also prevent it from happening. So this kind of understanding that on one hand, we can protect the freedom of speech, very important democratic value. On the other hand, there are ways how we can guarantee that the freedom of speech is not necessarily freedom of reach. So we can also mitigate this type of issues of spreading manipulated information. And lastly, of course, this is one of the factors that is being very much discussed about how to build the resilience of the citizens, right? Who are the ultimate, basically, victims or targeted actors of this information that can potentially influence their electoral behavior or their fears and therefore responses towards each other as members of a community, society, but also on a political scale. Right, in a way of acting and believing some things. We saw that during COVID-19 pandemic, disinformation had clear security implications, that people were dying, the impact of not knowing and not having accurate information in a timely manner from authoritative sources led to lethal effects. So it is critical during in the democratic times, but not only during the pandemics, but elsewhere and other times to actually take this very seriously and understand that the measures of media literacy, digital literacy, engagements of different actors in decision-making on these issues, discussing this in a public fora like we are doing also today, but also many other times. But also one of the things I would like to raise is intragenerational cooperation, because as a lot of this information is shared online, we are also facing many times that some people are much more used to working with online media and aware, and others perhaps less. And therefore, the level of resilience to this type of amplified disinformation differs strongly also based on age categories. There are quite a few other things I think we may have a chance to discuss later.
Let's leave the discussion.
But I would just end it at this point now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I turn immediately to Andrew Liaropoulos, Assistant Professor at the University of Piraeus. Andrea, παρακαλώ.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, with my presentation, we'll go a bit local, look at the Greek case study, and analyze kind of the oxymoron. On the one hand, Greece, as a member of NATO and the EU, has condemned the Russian military invasion in Ukraine, has sent military aid, of course, has supported the Ukrainians. But on the other hand, there is a part of the Greek public opinion that is, compared to other states, more, let's say, pro-Russian. So I would like to analyze that a bit. And the way I'm going to look is explore the so-called Russian influence operations in Greece and identify mainly structural, but also circumstantial factors that explain this. So to begin with, regarding the terms, I use the term influence operation. It's not really something new. You can see in the literature as information operation, propaganda, active measures, if you go back to the good old times during the Soviet Union, the Cold War. What I'll try to do is focus on what happened more or less the last 2 decades. But before that, let's have a look in the past and identify mainly 2 factors. For me, in a way to explain this is to look back in the history and in a way identify the historical bonds between Greece and Russia. So in a way, we have to think whether how we read history, how we understand or partly misunderstand our history, the role, historically speaking, the role of Russia in relations to Greece, in helping Greece liberate from the Ottoman Empire, through those two centuries, whether Russia has played a significant role in terms of the Greek-Turkish relations, in terms of the Cyprus issue, and many more. So one thing to consider is how we read or misread history, and whether that affects part of the Greek public opinion, believing that Russia is a good friend, an important ally, or somebody that would help us in the near future in many areas regarding security, foreign policy, etc. This is one thing, and we'll see in a minute how it also links with another second important aspect that has to do with the cultural and religious ties. Obviously, Greece is mainly an Orthodox country, so here we have to see how Moscow is playing the so-called Orthodox card. Russians are considered to be our Orthodox brothers. Just think about how we, as Greece, saw the wars in Yugoslavia 2 to 3 decades ago, about Serbians being an Orthodox brother and having a sense of sympathy in a way. So this is the old Orthodox link about Orthodoxy all over the world. It is a fact, I think, that up to a point, Russia, through the Russian Orthodox Church, has utilized some sort of, let's say, religious, ecclesiastical, whatever, soft power. It's very indicative in Mount Athos and all the Russian monasteries. Religious is important in Greece. Actually, it's one of the things that we still consider as very important, as one of the institutions. So this probably explains that up to a point, there is a religious, let's say, underground link that leads to the fact that many in Greece believe that there is, or there should be, a Greek-Russian friendship. Finishing with the religious aspect, it's also important to think of how Russia has used the Russian Orthodox Church in relation to, let's say, a battle antagonism with the Ecumenical Patriarch, but also in the case of Ukraine last year, or actually years before, how they used, again, the religious card in order to manipulate and break down the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So I'm saying this because, and to at least to the non-Greek audience, it might sound a bit weird, but the result of this, let's say, propaganda or misinformation, disinformation, we have some, let's say, popular historical, geopolitical / religious myths. A favorite one is that Russians, being the blonde nation or the blonde savior, then somehow they will save us or support us because of the Orthodox ties, and Moscow will serve as the third Rome in terms of religious policy, stuff like that. Another small example of how this has a practical effect is if we look at the case of Alexandroupoli. Alexandroupoli, a small city, a port, is actually quite important nowadays, because also for as part of the American and Greek-American defense cooperation. But it's a city on the north that has been twinned with the cities of St. Petersburg and Simferopol in Crimea. And it's interesting because that happened in 2016. So it's in a context that was post-Crimea. So this, from my understanding, are things that we have to think and deal with, because they're not going to go away. These are the structural factors, the way I see it. But there are also other factors, and that goes to how, let's say, previous years, the last decade, Russia actually exploited the fact that we had a financial crisis, migration crisis in Greece. This weakened the political system. And I think that Russia showed this as a window of opportunity in order to influence more the political system, both at the far right and far left in general, but also the Greek public. Adding to that, there was obviously a sense of Euroscepticism, up to a point healthy, but then again, Russians exploited that. Adding to that also the sense that there is in part of the Greek public a sentiment of anti-Americanism. These are two factors that Russia exploited last decade up to now, and portrayed many things as something that the EU is failing, and the EU is doing many bad things. The EU is or NATO or whatever, US is not a good ally, and we should, let's say, focus more on having better relations with Russia. So to summarize on that very briefly, I think that if we look at three factors, the historical and the friendly feelings linked to history, the common culture based on orthodoxy, and the mistrust towards the West, partly towards the West, whether it's the EU, NATO, or the US. It partly explains why some Greeks feel that, or in a way, are still pro-Russian or favorite to Putin. Going to the let's say the Ukraine crisis, there are many things we could see about how the conflict, the war, and all the narratives were portrayed in all the media, but also in the Greek media. I'm not going to go into details because there are many stories, and I'm sure we can all remember some of them. It was a big thing about blaming who was the bad guy, who was the good guy, whether it was an invasion or not, whether there's a Nazi regime in Ukraine, and again, the Russians are fighting the Nazis, and the link with, historical with the Second World War, etc. What happens to ethnic Greeks in Ukraine, about the atrocities, etc. So this is in a way a tactical thing that also we have to consider of how Russian media or Russian-friendly, whatever media, alternative media in Greece utilize this. Two final points before I go to something that also Nadia mentioned earlier. Two final small, in a way, factors is that we have to take into consideration the fact that there is a long-standing aversion in Greece, in the Greek public, of being involved in military interventions abroad and sending, let's say, troops or even weapons. So I'm not just saying that in terms of Ukraine. It's something that is a long-standing issue. So it's something that partly explains not being very enthusiastic about that. And another argument, which, to be honest, I cannot really judge whether it has some value because it has some operational aspects of whether, let's say, we would weaken our defense in case, our defense position, in case we're sending arms, weapons abroad in Ukraine, in case of, scenario crisis with Turkey. To get to the final point, because I find this very important, and actually the reason for being here, get lessons learned and think proactively of what we can do to counter in the near future, things like that. Nadia covered a lot of ground, but the way I see it, it's, in terms of the information environment, it's a battle of narratives. So the one that has the most convincing narrative will, up to a point, gain influence and, again, some political gains. So one thing that I had in mind, and I'm speaking in general in terms of both Greece, EU, NATO, whatever the Western community you want to define it, is first of all, you have to gain a better knowledge about, I don't want to label it, the enemy, the antagonist, the threat, whatever. Today it's Russia, tomorrow it might be China or anybody else. So think about history, think about its geopolitical goals, even the way they're exercising the information operations. The other thing we have to do is identify all the necessary stakeholders and have a common narrative, whether it's the government, the European Union, NATO. Is it going to be the media? Is it going to be NGOs over there? So we should have a solid narrative, whatever that is. I'm not judging right now. The other thing, obviously, is raise public awareness, counter and identify the disinformation. And in that field, we can even use social media algorithms, engage social media platforms in a critical way. And last but not least, we have to, in a way, educate and train the elites, whether it's the political elite or the media elite, in order to identify propaganda and counter this. So these are my points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And our last but not least contributor, also remotely, Michael Miller from Columbia University, who's going to talk to us, I gather, about the increasingly juicy subject of Ukraine as a factor in American politics.
Yeah, don't judge whether I'm least until you've heard me speak. I will try. I've been asked to speak about, and thanks for having me. It's nice I would much rather be in Athens than snowy New York right now, but alas. I've been asked to talk about the links between American public opinion and what may happen in future elections. I'm a scholar of elections, so I can speculate a little bit on that. So a good jumping off point, I think, is thinking about views as we understood them during the 2022 midterm election. The reason why I choose this point to start is because I think we have the best data on public opinion surrounding this election. And the numbers that you're seeing here are the result of the consortium that the Associated Press and Fox News conduct during election calling. And you can see there are approximately 25,000 respondents that are contributing to this poll, which I think makes it a pretty good snapshot of the electorate, not the mass public, but this is the people who were voting in the 2022 election. And you can see that you will expect to see some differences between this figure and surveys of the American public at large. But nonetheless, this poll gives us a nice snapshot into how voters who we would think are a little bit more informed than the public at large on these issues are viewing the public. And if you go to the top pane there, which I've highlighted with the red square, you'll see that a third of the public thinks that the role that the U.S. takes in solving the world's problems is about right. We see higher support than that for the Ukraine issue specifically, which indicates that the American public is thinking about this issue in a little bit different terms than we do when we have a general question. And this 40% figure that you see bottom right there, 40% of the American public feeling like the support for Ukraine is about right, that's been pretty sticky. And across a range of questions, the about right category tends to lead the more active and less active categories or variants. And this has been true for the duration of the conflict and across a range of pollsters and question wordings. So put another way, more of the American public has expressed satisfaction with the United States approach to the war at any given time than has wanted us to change something about it. That, I think, is a theme that must be stressed here, and that I'll shortly return to. We have lots of evidence for solid, stable support of Ukraine among the American public at large. But that said, compared to other foreign policy issues, Ukraine can be a thorny one in polling because during the Trump administration, we saw the emergence of partisan rhetoric directed towards Russia and the region more broadly, as well as the now infamous call with President Zelensky that led to the first impeachment of Donald Trump. We know from the work of John Zoller and other political scientists in our field that signaling from so-called elites, politicians, media figures, and the like is highly likely to influence opinion of co-partisans in the mass public. And so the ground before the invasion was already seeded for partisan differences on policy in this region. And we do see in the same data that I just showed you, segmenting by party of respondents, we see partisan differences in the approach to the war. Within the about right category, which is what you're seeing here, 60% of those responses are coming from Democrats, with 38% from Republicans. And that mirrors a lot of trends that we've seen on these data. We can get temporal traction on this with some Pew data, which I've done here. I've summarized 4 Pew polls going back to the start of the conflict. The question wording here is, when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. is providing blank support to Ukraine. Now, your eyes are going to be drawn to a few trends. First, the partisan gap on the too much pane, which is to the left here. It's much wider now than it was a year ago. And that's a story that a lot of people want to run with, but I think we should note that at the outset of the war, Republicans were more likely than Democrats to be in both extremes. They simultaneously were more likely to say that there was too much support and not enough. And I think this may indicate that Republican voters are responding to out-party messaging from elites, as with other so-called hard issues, issues that are difficult for the mass public to readily understand. It's really hard to know whether the trends we see on figures like this are genuine reactions to the conflict or simply reflect partisan signaling from respondents as they take in. Alex was talking about Tucker Carlson earlier. I think he's a really important part of the narrative here when we're talking about public opinion among the American right on this issue. So I think that rather than focusing on the extremes, which is tempting, I think we should not ignore the middle pane. And when we talk about the percentage of American public who thinks that what we're doing in Ukraine is about right, we see actually a great deal of stability. Respondents in both parties fluctuate within about a 7-point window. And while Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say we're getting this about right, that stability, I think, is a really important part of this story, and one that we should focus on. We can echo that a little bit with a recent poll from Gallup. This is from February, and this is their image of their poll. It finds a clear majority of the public still committed to supporting Ukraine, even in the event of a prolonged conflict. And support is holding steady at about 2/3 overall since last summer. And that's remarkably stable. And the wording of this question is, I think, a lot better than the Pew version that we saw, because it encourages respondents to think through their true preferences rather than succumb to the party temptation to revert to whatever you think your party might do on support or spending, which is the way that a lot of these questions get asked. And that, I think, leads us then to a consideration of where we will go in the United States once we consider the link between public opinion and election strategy and governance. I think the Gallup data backing up, this trend right here is really the key data point when thinking through the politics of how this will evolve. A crucial question with both domestic and international implications is, will the war in Ukraine become a campaign issue in the 2024 presidential election? A lot of people think it's too soon to know, but we are seeing signs that it's going to be at least discussed in some circles. It's true that more Republicans than Democrats are skeptical of sustained support in Ukraine. This, coupled with the fact that a Democratic president is managing the flow of resources to Ukraine, might seem to make this fertile ground for Republican candidates looking to draw contrasts between themselves and Democrats in Washington. And just last night, Ron DeSantis on Tucker's show characterized the conflict as a territorial dispute and said that protecting Ukraine is not a vital U.S. interest. Now, that is scary for people who are concerned about sustaining American support in the region, but I would point out that it's exactly the kind of position we can expect Republicans to take. Characterize this as wasteful spending so that they can draw contrasts with the current Democratic administration. And so for people who are concerned about events in Ukraine, I think rhetoric like this is worth paying attention to, though. But it's also important, and probably more important, if we were thinking about the fall election, to remember that last slide from the Gallup data. It usually isn't good politics to cut against a 2/3 majority. So while we might see some mention of the issue in Republican primaries, it really doesn't seem like the kind of position a candidate would want to hang their hat on in a general election. Simply, the American public at large appears committed for now to the cause in Ukraine. We may well see Republicans soften their position as they campaign in the general election. But Republicans of late have also understood that they can make opinion as well as respond to it. And that is something that Donald Trump did, I think, exceptionally well with his base. So if this is a deeply held view in DeSantis's mind, we have reason to believe it's a deeply held one in Trump's mind. It could signal their intentions as president to use the so-called bully pulpit to shape public opinion and to govern as they wish. So in short, regardless of what they are saying today, I do think it's too early to tell how Republican candidates may actually govern if elected. It's worth mentioning, however, that whether President Biden is reelected or not, most analysts expect the Senate to be under Republican control after the 2024 election, which could, on its own, impede Biden's ability to appropriate funding or other resources to the war. As American politics have proven to be impossible to predict of late, we will have to wait and see. And that's what I have to say.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I'll throw it open to the audience because we don't have that much time. I just want to clarify something, Professor Miller. Those percentages that have been the same between August and January, are they the same also for Republicans? Is there a breakdown in terms of Republicans, or has the skepticism among Republicans grown in the last few months?
I have not seen a party breakdown among the Gallup data. I can attempt to recover one, though, here in the next few minutes.
All right. Okay, questions from the audience. The lady in the first row.
Okay, thank you for the presentations. My name is Eleni Kapsokoli. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Piraeus. I have two questions with digital character for Mr. Kovalsikova. The first one, do you believe that the EU has succeeded in promoting and externalizing its values, its norms and regulations regarding cybersecurity to the region of Western Balkans? The also Brussels effect is on way or not? And the other question is that EU is promoting the e-voting and the digitalization of electoral processes. We have, for example, the tech-oriented state of Estonia with the e-voting. Do you believe that the member states have the ability, the cyber capabilities, the cyber security culture, and the digital resilience in order to prevent a digital electoral interference with direct or indirect manner? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So for the first question about success of promoting the values, especially regarding cybersecurity, I think this goes beyond cybersecurity, right? This is about, as you said, Brussels effect, right? Like how successful EU is in its strategic communication. I think it's a question of a process. Like what EU is recognizing is the importance of enhancing strategic communication, and what we have seen at the EU level, that the funding and the resources, being financial or human resources for strategic communication, especially in the External Action Service, have been rising. So we have new task forces on the East, on Western Balkans, on MENA region. So there are more people with more money working on these issues, but also within other EU institutions. There is also within even European Parliament second or the new mandate of the Special Committee on Countering Foreign Interference, including disinformation, which is, I think, quite an also important in a way democratic engagement of different political representatives from different member states. So there is much more focus on enhancing strategic communication as a tool of prevention, but also perhaps building this resilience against interference. But also, as I mentioned, if you look at it more holistically, other threats that are considered part of hybrid threats, including the cyber attacks. On top of it, there are new measures, especially in the cyber front. There is the cyber toolbox as part of the strategic compass as well, and the tools of the EU that is really trying to coordinate the efforts, have centralized also resources to be able to detect the cyber threats, because with cyber, I think we are only going to be having more and more need to actually look into the cyber threats. You doing your postdoctorate, you are probably very much aware of the fact as well that there's just so much we just don't know that is happening. So there's probably the attacks we are able to identify and detect are just a part of actually what's happening there. And I think this awareness is growing, and it's going to be even increased. For your second question, I will not comment necessarily on the member states' capabilities, representing more the EU here. But indeed, I think looking at the example of the country or countries that are having more digitalized ways to contribute to elections, to transparency or access of it, is an interesting way to think about participation and more democratic kind of approach to have access to voting, being also by mail, email, or from abroad, and different ways to really enhance the participation of people to vote. The way to do it in a safe manner, I think it's a critical one, and I think that there's still a lot to do.
Thank you.
I do have the answer to your question. From earlier, it's 53% of Republicans, so a majority still support Ukraine support Ukraine in reclaiming territory, even if prolonged conflict. There's a gap. It's 81% for Democrats, but still a majority among Republicans.
All right, thank you. Is there someone else who hasn't asked? If not, okay, please.
Thank you for your question. Now, as time goes on and as ammunition expenditures remain at the levels that they are now, the United States is going to steadily, and the West in general is going to steadily be even more stressed in providing support for Ukraine. And the question of providing support will start to turn from an issue of political will to an issue of industrial production. So my question is, what is the probability of this necessity or this reality being turned into political argument in Western elections or in U.S. elections outside the primaries of the Republican Party over the general at the level of the general election? Thank you.
Who would like to take that? Professor Goffman, perhaps?
Thank you for your question. So the thing is that that's what the kind of the far right parties are trying to do in Germany. That's what they're trying, that they're capitalizing on the increased expenses and the gas prices and issues like that. So this is what their far right agents are pretty much trying to do. So they're saying, why do we care about Ukraine? We need to care about the bills that we pay for our apartments. And we'll see what happens in German elections. But for instance, in local elections here in the Netherlands, Ukraine does not necessarily come up, even though in some cases there is some, I wouldn't say actually it's related to weaponry, because in the Netherlands it's not necessarily about the weapons, it's about hosting refugees. And this is so on a local level, there's kind of some uncertainty about, because even the status that the refugees receive, it is a temporary protection status. It's not a refugee status. So a lot of those people, they kind of, local governments are kind of expecting them to go back to Ukraine, but they can't go back to Ukraine. And this creates some strain on local governments and some dissatisfaction with the more overarching policies that are supposed to come from higher level in regards to more comprehensive refugee policy as well, and what to do with the temporary protection status in general. What happens after the war is over even. So there's a lot of uncertainty over that.
All right, further questions? Gentlemen, first row.
Hello, Yanis. From ELIAMEP Advisory Council. I have some comments on the slide on the statistics of the European perception of who is holding back the peace process, with the UK on one extreme and Italy on the other. Perhaps apart from reflecting a misunderstanding of realities or being susceptible to propaganda, this also reflects, perception of national self-interest, i.e. who might have closer ties to China or bigger investments in the economy, or more links to Russian energy or, Russian-controlled energy across the Mediterranean, but also reflective of, historical perception against NATO from countries that lost the last war, to the people that are at the core of NATO. So there's a combination, I think. I don't think it's just a mixed message. I think it's, perception of interest and identity. As far as the strange dichotomy in the Republican perception of what's being done or ought to be done, from too much on the one extreme to not enough on the other, I think also this reflects that there are two Republican parties within the Republican Party. There's an inward-looking isolationist one from the Rust Belt, supportive of the Trump-style populism, making America great again. And then you have the globalist interventionist, let's say the inheritors of the neocon from the previous Republican regime.
Yanni, I trust this is leading to a question.
Okay. My question would be that so far there has not been so much. First of all, I don't realize it was just questions, so apologies for that.
That's okay.
Late. Secondly, the US so far has not had a great cost in supporting the Ukraine, apart from the cost of weapons. Politically, it's been beneficial, and in terms maybe of energy flows, it's also been beneficial. What could change in that cost profile, which would later be reflected in the statistical analysis we saw? Thank you.
I think Professor Miller is on the spot for that one.
I think elite framing is really important here. I think from the perspective of the average American voter, not a lot is going to change. And I think there's a lot of room for politicians then to make hay out of these kinds of comparisons, right? Pointing out the financial expenditures, pointing out that we may draw down our own defense capacity or military production capacity in defense of, I mean, you're already beginning to see this with DeSantis characterizing this as a territorial dispute. That's exactly the kind of word description that we would expect from politicians trying to change the calculus of their voters. So I don't know that voters' actual lives will change, but I think that elite rhetoric surrounding the issues may lead them to different conclusions with the same data.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Marilisa, there on the second row.
Hello, my name is Marilisa Anastasiopoulou. I'm kind of a journalist, let's put it like that. My question goes to Mr. Miller, Professor Miller. When it comes to the US and the Republicans saying it's not vital, Ukraine is not vital, fair enough, we shouldn't continue giving money without knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future, fine. But is there another discussion what will happen if they don't support Ukraine and leave Russia in the hands of China? Because right now we kind of see China stepping up in its position in the area and its political presence much more than before, when it was only economical and trade, let's put it like that. So, okay, they say we will not support, we may not support, but what will happen afterwards? Is there discussion on that?
I think that will be the Democratic response. I think that's the natural response to somebody characterizing this as a territorial dispute. Now, American politicians love to make analogies to fascist Germany and patterns of conquest that we saw in the 1930s and 40s. And I think you're going to see that too, because they resonate with people. They're a way for people to understand the implications of what will happen if we withdraw support. But the way that you describe it, I think, would be the talking points out of any Democratic candidate, particularly Joe Biden's playbook. He is aware of the fact that support and trust of Russia is in single digits right now, that support and trust of China is collapsing also. And while there is some partisan trend with respect to these two countries, I think that people in both parties are sensitive to what they perceive to be degrading American influence in Asia, particularly, and Eastern Europe at large. And I think there is a great potential for those kinds of arguments to resonate with voters, particularly if 2/3 of them are already predisposed to supporting Ukraine. So I think you identify exactly the axis that politicians in the United States will take as they debate these issues. Given polling data that we've seen, I think voters are probably going to recognize that this is not something that we should walk away from. But I'm often wrong about what voters think, so I would include that important caveat.
All right, I want to thank all our panelists. I want to thank our audience, and I leave you in the hands of our convener for a final word.
Thank you very much, Yanis, for an excellent role. I mean, you will be asked to repeat it, I'm afraid. You know, if you are good, I mean, this is the prize. But let's say, talking seriously, I would like, first of all, to thank the Columbia team for making this happen. And it's a great cooperation. And I think we have also to thank the architect of this cooperation, Professor Andreas Goffes, present here today, member of the board of the Institute. Also, the fantastic dream team of Pantelis Rafael, which supported, I mean, technically, digitally, the whole event. There are many, many people watching online, and the video will stay on our website for the coming weeks. So we will have even more viewers, I think. And of course, I have to thank our institute team. Thank you very much for your support, Maria and you, and our audience, and hope you will be with us next week as well, because we are quite frequent here.
Ναι, 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 ναι. Οι βεβαιώσεις ακούγεται.